So it is my pleasure to introduce Hannah Landecker, who is a professor of sociology at the UCLA Institute for Society and Genetics. She uses the tools of history and social science to study contemporary developments in the life sciences and their historical taproots in the 20th century. Her book, Culturing Life, How Cells Became Technologies, was published by Harvard University Press in 2007. In her talk, Metabolic Materialism, Professor Landecker will discuss the intellectual history of materialism and vitalism through a close examination of combustion chemistry, digestive ferments, and the practical chemistry of foodstuffs of the early to mid 19th century. Okay, so thank you, Professor Landecker, and the floor is yours.
These things are always made for tall people. All right. Can everyone hear me okay? Well, I'm very pleased to be here. I'm coming to you from this is the first day of my exit from a year-long sabbatical. So I'm celebrating the end of my sabbatical by not being at work. And during that sabbatical, I've been working on a book which I think could nicely be called long awaited, and my editor might call atrociously overdue. And so I thought I would start by telling you a little bit about the kind of thought space that this talk is coming from, so that it can be contextualized for you. As Christopher said, I work in a department of sociology at the University of California, Los Angeles, but that's 50% of my appointment. The other 50% is in the life sciences, where I direct the Institute for Society and Genetics. So I'm a bit of a hybrid. I'm a social scientist. I do ethnography, which some people call dedicated hanging out. And I've been doing a lot of ethnography in spaces where people are doing research on metabolic disorders, broadly understood. So that ranges from diabetes to metabolic origins of cancer, spending some time in epigenetics laboratories and a little bit of microbiome work. And in the process of doing this work, I have come to some conclusions, let's say. I get to say that at the end of this year. So in working in the contemporary scene, working with epigenetics, microbiomics, circadian biology, DNA repair, genome instability, and one-carbon metabolism, which feeds into epigenetic processes, doing a close sort of inhabitation of these sciences in the present, I've come to think of not nurture versus nature, but nurture metabolizes nature. That is, that at every moment in every cell, DNA is being metabolized through processes of one-carbon metabolism. If you want to methylate a cytosine residue, right, you have to produce a methyl group, and it has to be produced in a metabolic cycle. And that metabolic cycle is, of course, in a cell, and a cell is in a body, and a body is in the world. So there's this constant, incessant pullulation of process to keep the thing that we call the genome stable. Every time it breaks or has a lesion, it has to be fixed. The biology of chromatin is this thoroughly metabolic process. So this is one of the perhaps provocative formulations that I've come to through this ethnographic observation, is that a 20th century hierarchy where you had executive genes which run housekeeping genes, where the genome runs metabolism and metabolism just goes round and round and keeps the body going, is perhaps too binary of a formulation. And that really I have come to think of the genome as something which has to be constantly metabolized to be what it is. A second sort of summing up of years of observation is that across these different areas of science, food is becoming something quite other than fuel or building blocks, that food is as much information as it is energy. We can think of the various experiments or work on shift workers and metabolic disorder that show the timing of food is as important as its content. We can look at the crazy new work that's emerging around microRNAs in exosomes, in foodstuffs that enter into gene regulation participation in the microbiome or in the human body. Things like sirtuin and the way that energy balance itself becomes an information signal. So all of these things have suggested to me that categories such as information or energy that are very 20th century categories are increasingly insufficient in the current scene for capturing the nature of incorporation. And I've come to think of this as a kind of ontological fracturing. Categories of energy and information, metabolism and reproduction, gut and brain. I could go on in this list, right? Sense and viscera, inside and outside. They're kind of creaking under the weight of all kinds of efforts to produce findings that speak to some of the crises of metabolic disorder in our current society. And so I don't mean that these categories are disappearing. We still talk, we still use these terms very, very freely, but they're kind of beginning to crack. These categories are beginning to crack and leak into one another. So when I speak about DNA as being constantly metabolized, that's one instance of that. So in occupying this current situation of thinking about metabolism and the way that the concept of metabolism is really in a situation of kind of breaking open and becoming other, I of course began to think of, well, if I'm going to make the claim that things are changing, then I have to understand how they were to begin with, where they came from. And this is where a very long excursion into the past of metabolism has originated. So I just wanted to give you that context that I am very much thinking about the present in doing the kind of history that I'm going to present to you today. So I wanted to understand both the history of metabolism and to a certain extent to reverse that, the metabolism of history. That is, today, I work with scientists who are working on very particular kinds of objects and tools in their laboratories. So let's just use the example of shift work, for example. The shift worker has become a kind of model organism for the intersection of circadian biology and metabolism. And so you often see blood samples taken from those subjects, or you see mouse models of those subjects, and that is the metabolism that the materiality that people are working on. So how has that shifted? How has that changed over time? So that's what I mean by reversing that. What was metabolism as a material object of inquiry then and now? So one of the ways that I work is very much from a tradition in the history of science, which has really developed over the last couple of decades, and that is to really pay attention to the material culture of science. So in going back to the 19th century and asking this question of where did metabolism come from as a concept, it's very important to me to always ask what is the material culture of that science. And interestingly, it does different things to these categories of mechanist, vitalist, reductionist, holist, materialist. We can identify a material culture to all of these ideas. So from the chyle, the digested stuff in the stomach, of 18th century digestive force, to the industrial coal tar substrates of the 19th century, rise of organic chemistry. These sciences are just profoundly shaped by the materials and instruments of manipulation and detection through which they're conducted. So that's really a premise of how I'm doing my historical work. Just this, I didn't really know quite what audience to anticipate, so I'm giving some background here to this approach. A French philosopher of science, Bachelard, it has been used by Hans-Jörg Reinberger to kind of articulate this material practice approach to the history of science. And one thing that's very important in looking at the formation of ideas and theories from this approach is to really look at instruments and instrumentation. So this fancy word, phenomenotechnology, is just to capture the idea that the phenomena of science have to be selected, purified, and shaped by instruments. Indeed, it may be the instruments that produce the phenomenon in the first place. And it's a cycle. Conversely, the phenomena produced in the experiment, for their part, provide the occasion to problematize the theoretical assumptions that are embodied in the instruments. So Bachelard theorizes this as a productive circularity. It's not that you only see what you want to see because you build your ideas into the instruments. You build instruments to kind of test reality, and those things impinge on the assumptions that you went in with, and it keeps on going. It's both an idea about how science works and a methodology. That is that if you're going to follow instruments and how instruments work, you don't necessarily study disciplines. Again, Bachelard says that you see these islands of scientific rationality arise, these patterns, cantons, or regions that suddenly arise on the basis of an instrument or experiment. But their margins are fluid and they can disappear or merge together with other unities. And I thought that this would be useful for us as a kind of methodological background for thinking about things like vitalism and materialism, because we can talk about science not in terms of disciplines or not in terms of who is a vitalist and who is a mechanist and who is a materialist, but rather in terms of the research process and the instruments that are feeding into the descriptions that people are making in these traditions. I'll add to that it's not just nature that scientists are working on and not just instruments that come out of nowhere, but that there is a profound historicity already to the materials that scientists are working on. This is the work of Ursula Cline and Wolfgang Lefebvre on the history of chemistry. Materials have history. Substances were not universal, immutable objects given by nature, but objects shaped in human practice and having the same historicity and contingency as human practice. So their example is that coal tar, which was a product of the gas industry, shifts things so profoundly in organic chemistry that organic chemistry before the late 1820s and after 1840 is structurally so different that we should speak of two different scientific cultures. So it's not just that ideas about nature change over time, but that the very object of scientific inquiry has a historicity that is tied into what humans are doing with industry and those kinds of things. So that is also a kind of foundational assumption of looking at science in the 19th century. So a second premise that I'm working with here, and again, maybe it's an obvious one, but just to lay the groundwork here, is that 19th century science was a very important resource for various other 19th century materialisms, political materialism, dialectical materialism, what the historian Anson Robbenbach calls the transcendental materialism, which claimed to be materialist but was very abstract. And that specifically, it just wasn't 19th century science generally, but much of this science was very metabolic in its nature. And actually, as you'll see as I go along, it's a bit hard to call it, it's a bit anachronistic to call it metabolic, because at the time it was digestive or nutritive, or it was about fermentation, or it was input-output physiology in the German tradition of Stoffwechsel. And really, we only come to call that metabolic later. So from Moleschot's free and just distribution of force and matter, to Vogt's extrapolation from changing secretions with diet to changing thought, because thought was a secretion of the brain, to Marx's mobilization of Stoffwechsel as the stuff for understanding how labor intermediates man and nature, digestive and metabolic sciences were a really, really important resource for political thought in the 19th century. Now, one of the things that I noticed in going back to this literature is that much of 19th century materialism is a weirdly dematerialized materialism, a materialism embodied in the primacy of energy. And Bachelard again says the very fact that energy changes matter results in a particular shift of scientific language from metaphor to abstraction. And I think that this has left a profound imprint on the historiography, and I have to ask my more philosophical colleagues to, perhaps to a certain extent, philosophy of metabolism in life in the 19th century and its legacies for the 20th century, because the history is read through the trajectories of thermodynamics and energy, rather than the trajectories of physiology or biochemistry, which tend to stick closer to matter and its transformation. So in this talk, rather than asking or analyzing how a given scientist or a scientific program is materialist or mechanist or vitalist, or usually actually some combination of those, I'm going to ask whether through these approaches, through these methodologies of material culture, can we identify ways in which materialism or vitalism is distinctively metabolic, where to be metabolic means to be thought through the experimental practices and instruments of cell biology, where metabolism was first coined, animal chemistry, industrial food chemistry, physiology, and slightly later endocrinology. This approach means also to really stick with matter. Calories aside, which of course is the thermodynamic trajectory of this science, it's the matter-to-matter transformation that's at stake in many of these sciences more than the matter-to-energy transformation. So science had a material practice and culture, plus a lot of it was concerned with metabolic, nutritive, fermentative, enzymatic, digestive, or animal chemical. Plus, it was an important resource for political and ideological thought. The question, do we have something that we could identify as metabolic thought? It also leaves us with a more general question of the life science culture of materialism, the historicity of the materials at play, and the role of things which have really been kind of siloed into very specific disciplinary histories of microbiology or endocrinology, but the role of combustion chemistry, ferments, glycogen, duodenums in constituting modern concepts. Okay, so I don't have a lot of time to explore the span of the 19th century, so I'm just going to give you one example. I have a tendency to tend to my lecture time, which is an hour and 15 minutes. So one example will do to keep it to 40 minutes. So the example that I'm going to use is this instrument, the Kali apparat, which was developed by the German chemist Justus von Liebig. He really began to work with it in the 1830s. You'll see here that it becomes the logo of the American Chemical Society, and it is a tool of analysis in the true meaning of analysis, in that one combusts materials in order to weigh the amount of carbon and nitrogen in those materials. The historian of science, Larry Holmes, said about Justus von Liebig and the Kali combustion chemistry's contribution to the publication Animal Chemistry of 1842, that probably the deepest single impact upon the future course of physiological thought and investigation derived from the publication in 1842 of a book by a man who had never performed an experiment on living animals. So another thing about the Kali apparat, which to my mind looks like an inverted large intestine, is that it really was a site of saying what was happening inside animals. It was an instrument for articulating metabolism, or what would actually for articulating Stoffwechsel, change of stuff. The German term is Stoffwechsel, as something which happened after digestion and before excretion. It gave it its own space, its own process, its own interiority that was not in the stomach, but was after digestion and before excretion. And on the basis of the experiments done with the Kali apparat with combusting materials and seeing that there was continuity in the elemental constitution of those things, but change in form, was the basis for Liebig's articulation of Stoffwechsel. It was also a form of industrialization of analysis. He bragged that in relation to Berzelius, a slightly older chemist credited with coining the notion of organic chemistry, the chemistry of carbon-based substances. So old Berzelius spent 18 months analyzing 7 organic acids with repetitions. In 3 months, we have completed 72 analyses without a failure. Berzelius, with his old apparatus, would have spent 5 years doing this work. So this instrument was also the industrialization of this form of analysis, and Liebig is credited with having a central role in founding and building organic chemistry as a pedagogical venture, which trained lots of people, but also significantly moving it from the school of pharmacy into the school of philosophy is also a significant sort of move of it from being a very practical, pragmatic, applied sort of science to one that could say something about the very nature of living things, and therefore a philosophical thing. So how did it actually work? This is a question that you have to ask when you take a material culture approach. So here's a little passage from Liebig. So how would they take something like meat and do combustion analysis on it? You can't burn meat, really. I mean, you can, it's July 4th, you can burn your meat on the barbecue. But to do combustion analysis, how would you not just burn it on the outside, but actually incinerate it? Well, they dried it first. And so in this case, here's just a description of the technique. When fresh drawn blood is made to trickle over a plate of silver, heated to 140 degrees, it dries to a red varnish-like matter, easily reduced to a powder. Muscular flesh free from fat, if dried first in a gentle heat and then at 212 degrees, yields a brown pulverizable mass. So these are the substances that would be combusted in this instrument. And again, this set of bulbs and the results that they yielded were this foundation for Liebig of saying what was happening in the muscles of the animal. Solid excrements are nothing else than the incombustible or imperfectly burned parts of food, which shows you that he was very much transposing this idea of combustion from the instrument into the body. As I mentioned, the material that is in these experiments is not just meat in some universal sense, but has the historicity of the change in human activity around these substances buried in it. Why was Liebig so interested in analyzing what was in meat and turning it into other forms. Well, he had this venture on the side, which has come down to us in the form of Bovril and the OxoCube, which was to figure out how to get cattle who were being raised in South America, where it was very cheap to raise cattle, to Europe. This was, of course, before refrigeration. So the idea was that you could extract what was important about meat and ship it in a much smaller form to Europe. So in this project in Argentina, 1 metric ton of cattle would produce 25 kilograms of Liebig's extract. So this was also a very practical question of how would you get the essence out of the cow. So this theory of Stoffwechsel, which we retrospectively translate as metabolism, was an idea that at each moment of life in the animal organism, a continued change of matter is going on. A part of the structure is transformed into unorganized matter, loses its condition of life, and must be again renewed. It's very important to realize that in this theory, this only applied to nitrogenous substances, so things that had nitrogen in them, and that this process was really understood to be the foundation of muscular work, right? That you worked with your muscles, they break down and become unorganized, and without feeding them nitrogenous substances, this building up with Stoffwechsel, you would lose your ability to do muscular work. The great contribution of animal chemistry was to depict the body as a balance sheet, and it was a systematic way of understanding how the elements of the bile and the urine added together must equal in the relative proportion of these elements to the composition of the blood. It's sometimes called the origin of input-output physiology, that you should be able to, just like in a combustion chamber, see the nitrogen going in and the nitrogen coming out and be able to know what was happening to it in the fluids in the body. It was a depiction of continuity of matter with change of form. Now, as is well known, as I said, these kind of metabolic digestive theories were a very important resource for political thought in the 19th century. So I just picked Marx as an example of this uptake. So this is Alfred Schmidt writing about capital. And he says that an attempt which runs throughout the whole of Marx's work is to provide an appropriate concept for the mutual penetration of nature and society within the natural whole. To this end, Marx used new and in part peculiarly biological metaphors, of which the expression metabolism used throughout Capital seems finally to have been chosen as the best formulation. Now, there are a couple of things that I wanted to note about this. As you can see, I put peculiarly biological metaphors in red because that's one of the things that stands out to me about this interpretation. We often talk about the uptake of science in society as a process of metaphorical or rhetorical work, right? The body is like a machine, or in this case, labor is the metabolism, is the Stoffwechsel between man and nature, because man organizes unorganized stuff through work and transforms it into another form without any break in elemental continuity. So the matter, the fundamental aspect of the matter doesn't change, but very importantly, the technology changes the form across this process of interaction of man and nature. I'd like to say that actually it's not a metaphor at all. Marx meant it extremely, extremely literally. And I have to make another super pedantic point. I really feel like a professor when I do this. I don't usually feel like a professor. Actually, the expression Stoffwechsel is used throughout Capital. The words metabolism, or if we're in German, metabolisch, don't appear at all in Das Kapital. Now, metabolic power, metabolism, was coined in 1839 by Theodor Schwann in his articulation of cell theory. It's not usually what's remembered about Schwann's work. So it was perfectly possible that it could appear in Marx, but Marx was drawing on Liebig and the idea of Stoffwechsel, and it was very specifically the idea of Stoffwechsel with its specificity of only applying to nitrogenous matter and the conversion of stuff in the blood into muscle. So until the 20th century, English translations only used the word exchange or exchange of matter in the places in Das Kapital where Stoffwechsel appears. So why on earth does that matter? Why is that, other than just like pedantic detail that professors say to each other? Because of this argument that I want to make about the specificity of the experimental material culture and the way that Marx thought that he was speaking literally, not metaphorically, that the combustive origin of these concepts is really, really important. And you can read it in the way that Marx uses the idea of consumption, to be consumed in combustion. So if you read Liebig, there's a very, very technical way in which consumption means for things to be incinerated and their elemental continuity to go on, but their products, something is consumed and then it forms products. This is the grammar of process that Marx is taking up. So the products were consumed in combustion and didn't disappear, but were transformed into muscle and then bile and urine. It happens at every moment, but it also has no duration. It's an explosive consumption of one form of matter with the production of other forms, yet with elemental continuity. So why does this matter? Well, it matters because there were other versions of nutrition or digestion or all of those things that these political ideas could be working with. Let's say Claude Bernard's ideas of the milieu intérieur and the nutritive reserve, but these have a really different kind of valence and process to them. In Bernard's concept, animals eat things and turn that matter into the matter of themselves and keep it there for later use. It's quite a different concept. So in Marx, you can see this very specific mobilization of the process of combustion chemistry. Just an example here for you, the capitalist profits not only by what he receives from, by what he gives to the laborer. The capital given in exchange for labor power is converted into necessities, by the consumption of which the muscles, nerves, bones, and brains of existing laborers are reproduced and new laborers are begotten. And so one point of this is to say that it's not just that the idea of Stoffwechsel as a metaphorical construct appears in this political thought, but that it forms a temporality and a grammar for that thought. That from my point of view, reading from my point of view of having embedded myself in how combustion chemistry works, I can't read capital without seeing that process at work in the logic. So it's not just combustion chemistry, it's other aspects of 19th century digestive fermentation science that are in there. The historian Dana Simmons has written a beautiful article about the history of the concept of the living wage, and asks this question, which is similar to my saying that the instruments of combustion chemistry live in capital. Well, what forms of life have lived in a wage? Well, fermentative ones. And again, in capital, you see fermentation science in the logic. The labor process is a process between things that the capitalist has purchased, things that have become his property. The product of this process also belongs, therefore, to him, just as much as does the wine, which is the product of a process of fermentation completed in his cellar. So I could go on, but I'm not a Marx scholar. And I will say that there are other conceptual trajectories of combustion chemistry. In writing about this period, I thought to borrow Foucault's idea of the clinical gaze to talk about how Marx had a chemical gaze on life and society by using this kind of science as a resource. And so I thought I'd better go back to Foucault and read the articulation of the clinical gaze there. And there, indeed, he writes, at the beginning of the 19th century, another model emerged, that of the chemical operation, which by isolating component elements made it possible to define the composition, to establish common points, resemblances, and differences with other totalities, and thus to found a classification that was no longer based on specific types, but on forms of relations. The clinician's gaze became the functional equivalent of fire in chemical combustion. It is through it that the essential purity of phenomena can emerge. It is the separating agent of truths. The clinical gaze is a gaze that burns things to their furthest truth. So even there, in my thinking that I would take this concept that is important to historians of science and thinkers beyond that, there I find combustion chemistry even within that concept in the first place. Okay, so at this point, we've come to the conclusion that we can read Marx and Foucault somewhat differently. And you may be asking yourself, so what? Especially if Marx and Foucault are not your landmarks, right? The point that I want to make through using this example is actually much broader. So the point is that many of our scientific, political, and analytical concepts in science, as well as in political thought, have these digestive, metabolic, nutritive, animal chemical origins. So I say they have this kind of metabolic spirit animating them. And the historicity of the matter through which those concepts were built is also in there with the instruments. At the same time, the metabolic character of many concepts, I will just claim, we could talk about this later, is surprisingly submerged or suppressed. For example, the hormone, the concept of the hormone. I was trained in history of science and specialized in 20th century life science. And I did not know until I went back and read the experimental papers that the concept of the hormone was based on work trying to understand the chemical coordination between the duodenum and the pancreas. So the first hormone discovered, although the word hormone had not been coined yet, was secretin, and was fundamental to Starling's conceptualization of a chemical nexus between different organs of the body whose purpose was to coordinate metabolic time and pacing in a different kind of temporality than the nervous system. Similarly, homeostasis. Homeostasis, of course, is an enormously powerful concept of the 20th century, coined by Walter Cannon in a book called The Wisdom of the Body, which was taken from a lecture given by Starling. You wouldn't know from the kind of work that has come around homeostasis, especially in cybernetics, that it was originally conceptualized through experimental, instrumental work with blood sugar, the regulation of blood sugar, and metabolic calorigenesis in the regulation of body temperature. So I could expand on these examples for you, but I just wanted to say that it's not just Marx, it's not just Foucault. Many of these fundamental concepts that we have these metabolic origins or metabolic spirits that shape them that then disappear once they're abstracted. So that begs the question of why. Why would the metabolic or the nutritive disappear in these conceptual structures? So these are speculative answers. One way to answer that is we can say with some certainty that in this period of transition between the 19th and the 20th century, the relative dominance of physics as a more fundamental description of matter than other sciences had something to do with the second law of thermodynamics and thermodynamics in general being viewed as the important trajectory of let's say, the sciences of input-output physiology and the discovery of the calorie. A second reason that I think is quite interesting, again, comes from the work of Ursula Cline. The ascendance of petroleum chemistry after 1840 really displaces and replaces a previously incredibly prolific and vigorous integration of chemistry and natural history in animal and vegetable chemistry. So these 1,000-page tomes of vegetable chemistry are replaced by an organic chemistry that is done on the hydrocarbon substances that chemists could now work with. So we see a disappearance of that kind of integration and a different separation between synthetic chemistry and biochemistry. We could blame Weissman and the division of germ and soma in the sense that he puts all of the, he gives a mechanism for putting the information in the germ, and the soma just goes round and round. We could blame the cyberneticians and their various rigorous division of things into hierarchies of information and energy. It is, after all, what the frog's eye tells the frog's brain, not what the frog's gut tells the frog's tongue. The cyberneticians said that metabolic matters were simply a kind of servant to the reproduction of pattern and really made a kind of separation and then a hierarchy between those two things. We might also say that there's a deeply gendered element to these hierarchies. All the way from the kind of late 19th century distinction of Nahrungsplasm and Idioplasm. One has the thought in it and one has the nutrition in it. Maybe these binaries that have come from a long way back are playing out here in very gendered ways, which we see, for example, in the distinction between executive and housekeeping functions of the cell. Okay, so in sum, as the concept of metabolism moves into new orientation today with concepts of life and health, including into new orientation in relation to genetics, it makes both the future and the past look different. I wouldn't have been able to do the kind of historical inquiry that I've done around the history of metabolic concepts without encountering them in flux in the present in my ethnography. What I hope to have shown through this analysis is that we may better diagnose the metabolic character of certain key modern concepts by taking a materialist approach to both materialism and vitalism then and now. So I would like to thank the fellowship that has given me the time to actually think over the last year, Christopher Kelty and Dana Simmons, and also the organizers for bringing me here. Thank you.
Okay, so we have some time for questions. I know there's active hands on this side of the room. So. Brooke. Yeah, I think your hand was just barely up first. It was...
Thank you so much. That was fascinating. And my question really converges on how you see the relationship between the material practices in the scientific cultures and what you talk about the uptake. So I was really struck by the fact what you don't want to talk about, which is metaphor, but that's another meta word, right, that implies a form of transformation. So I took it that that in not talking about metaphor, you oppose literalism, but it seemed like we need another form of metabolic transformation. And I wanted to know whether metabolism in that transformation, how you would conceptualize that. And there's a somewhat related question, which is how you see the relationship between practices of material culture in the laboratory and other forms of material practice, such as the letter, or Marx doesn't just have this idea, he writes a book and it becomes a technology that circulates about the ways in which embodied thought is influencing that kind of practice. So I was a little bit curious about how not to sort of create this divide between materiality on the one hand and then sort of thought on the other, but to think materiality across the board. So they're somewhat related, but I'm really curious to hear your thoughts on both of those.
So the only reason that I have a bit of an allergy to metaphor, it's not that I don't think that it's useful. Metaphorical techniques are so important in science as well as elsewhere, because especially when you're looking at things that haven't been described before, or you're trying to communicate them to others, you need to compare them to something unknowns to knowns, or you need to pattern the thing that you're conveying in terms of something else. So it is a fundamental operation of both scientific work in the first place and then the circulation of that science in broader culture. So that caveat there. But people have tended to leave behind all the other forms of rhetoric, right? And then that classic rhetorical science has, 56 terms or 120 or something like that. There are all of these operations of ellipsis or synecdoche, or there are many rhetorical operations, and they in the history and sort of cultural uptake studies of science, metaphor is given this pride of place and is the only thing that people look at. So that's one of the origins of my sort of allergy to metaphor. That then it also blinds to a certain extent our way of thinking about these thinkers as themselves thinking through the scientific process in ways other than a metaphorical likening there. So yes, metaphor is absolutely in operation here, but all kinds of other processes too. So your question was, well, is that not part of the uptake, right? Is that not part of the process of uptake? Well, absolutely, but I would say that someone like Marx is not just taking this at a surface level and saying the thing that I want to talk about is like this other thing over here, but that his very articulation of this phenomenon is thought through the process of how one thing becomes another that is available in someone like Liebig, or Liebig translated through other thinkers.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not defending metaphor. I'm just pointing out that metaphor and metabolism have the same reason. So in a way, the problem with metaphor is that we have, okay, it's disappeared. These metabolic concepts have disappeared. We want to restore them. Literalism versus metaphor, like we lose the sense of transformation. Metaphor, as you say, has a purchase on that. And I guess I'm wondering, what is a kind of metabolic way of understanding that transformation if it's not metaphor? It's not just restore it as the technological determinism. It's something, some kind of transformation has happened. And that's what I'm curious.
So I would say that there are many tools available for if we're thinking about restoring or recognizing the metabolic spirit of many of our concepts, looking at the work, say, of philosopher John Dupre, which really looks deeply into process philosophy and how he has this formulation by which he says that the things that are stable in biology are not things but processes, that and gives a kind of point of view on the temporal structure of explanation that is quite different than looking at the words that are used to describe a phenomenon. So there is a resource there to look at the temporality of a thing versus the imagery in the words there. So that's one way, right? That we could do that. I play with that obviously when I tell you that the genome is constantly being metabolized. That is not metaphorical. It's not a metaphorical statement. I'm saying that the genome is in the time of metabolism. That it is not a thing except in its constant production, adjustment, constitution through processes of metabolism. Right. So there is one way that I would say that we can access the metabolic without necessarily making an opposition there between the stuff and the thought, right? It's about temporal structure. The second part of your question, I've already forgotten.
You know what, I don't want to dominate this. If you want to go to other questions.
I think that would be good, just in the interest of time. Interesting as it is. So, Charles.
Well, thank you very much. About materialism and vitalism as metabolic, as being seen as metabolic. And of course, for free, I'd urge you to say even, a casual thought on what you think all of this says to vitalism per se, but that's just sort of for free question. But about the metabolic dimension of materialism, I think that's really crucial, and it sort of speaks to it's something that I've cared about or been concerned with for a while, and so I think it's fantastic to see it come out on these materials. I've had this pet peeve about, rebutting people who think that materialism is strictly physicalism, which then came up in its own way in one of your last slides, the, dominance of physics moment. And indeed, the metabolic materialism is a really beautiful instance of literally that. Now, not to preach to the choir, but since we don't all have the same backgrounds here, I'll just mention another episode, which is a century before what Hannah was describing. So, and which is less proper science because it's in an experimental written work. Diderot's famous work, D'Alembert's Dream, begins with this. So the character D'Alembert challenges the character Diderot, and it's about matter versus, not life, but matter versus thought. How dare you think that these can be the same or something. And the character Diderot says, well, allow the following thought experiment. And it's the statue made of marble, which is ground up and mixed with the earth. And then from the earth, plants grow, and ancient races of large bovines graze on the things that grow, and we eat them. And in that sense, it's just a matter of time for marble, us, living metabolic instances, thought to all just be on one continuum. That's at least the Diderot obsession. What's interesting there is this, in his case, a sort of fermentative, nutritive, and to some extent metabolic conception of matter is what he loads onto or into his conception of matter. So it's forcing all those properties to be properties of matter, and then bingo, you get a particular kind of materialism. You, perhaps the kind of Ursula Cline style things you were appealing to, allow you to tell a very different, it's like formally, it's a different kind of story. Whereas Diderot, it's like, yes, there are these processes. The more we know about vital chemistry, the more we see these processes at work. I'm going to heap those properties onto matter itself, which is something that Cecilia in her thesis also wrote about, by the way. But that kind of motif seems absent to me in so-called vitalism, which does not mean I'm trying to answer my question to you. I'm just saying that
You could.
the whole parts obsession, which Brooke used those terms, I don't remember if those terms got used again, the sort of mereological or broadly speaking whole parts problem, that's a constitutive problem for vitalism. And in some weird way, that obsession is very different than the bubbling ferment, even though fluids and sympathies and so forth are perhaps go between the two discourses.
Well, I can answer that by just saying that as someone who had never actually ventured very far back before 1900, and then being like, oh, crap, metabolism begins in 1839, or there was no metabolism before 1839. And then in this kind of naive way saying, well, let's just read the literature. Maybe I can write a 3-page preamble for the book. And then I got so incredibly stuck in the 19th century. It's taken me like 8 years to get back out of it. And I found it completely confusing because I would read somebody like Liebig, and the terms materialism and vitalism don't really help you understand Liebig, right? And because yes, there is this physico-chemical mechanism, like the chemical force that drives animals comes from their food. That's the essential claim there. And it is a physico-chemical, mechanical claim. So that doesn't necessarily make him a materialist. And indeed, the political materialists thought that he was hopelessly vitalist, right? In his appeal to a vital force that made a difference between organic chemistry and organized chemistry, right? That the living is a different quantity there. And so I just found it really confusing because each person that I encountered actually seemed to have their different combinatorial of mechanism, materialism, and vitalism. So those labels actually don't help you very much. This is why I find it so productive to turn to the instrument and the kind of cluster of phenomena, not just the instrument, but the matter that gets put in the instrument, to look at the cluster of negotiation around what is produced by that. So combustion chemistry can be taken up by all kinds of varieties of people. But I will say that in the general sort of sweep of thinking about things nutritive or metabolic, there is this very, very interesting encounter all of the time. Even if you are the most robust physicochemical adherent, you have to account for the fact that, as Joseph Needham liked to point out to his physicist colleagues, you don't find a carbohydrate anywhere in the universe except inside a body, right? And so the specificity of the living comes up again and again and again in metabolic sciences, and that I think is a deeply vitalist question, right? So that's my answer.
Okay, so Bohang.
Thank you very much for your talk. I think I'm worrying about maybe I misunderstand. I'm worrying about the tension, in this talk about the notion of matter.
Mm-hmm.
Like when we talk about metabolic materialism, there is the sentence we call the continuity of matter, but the change of forms.
Mm-hmm.
This gives us a sense something like matter is given in nature, but therefore, there are changes of forms. But when we get to the point of historical epistemology, I think there is a very interesting sentence saying that matter is not given in nature. Matter should be conceived, should be constituted. The notion of matter is constituted through our experimental practices.
Mm-hmm.
So there are two strands of thought. They kind of say, what is the notion of matter in nature? And then it's like for the final point, it's like the fundamental, it's like physics at the fundamental science. I think the first strand, like say nature is given, matter is given in nature. This is comfortable for them because they will say, okay, I mean, matter is always there, but by different kinds of scientific practices, we study the forms of matter. But the second, like say, nature is not given, matter is not given in nature. This will be very uncomfortable to them. They will say, okay, it sounds like, I mean, matter is invented by scientists themselves, and then the idea of matter is spreads, into the culture and society. So, like, I don't know, like, maybe I want to hear your comments on that.
So I am very much more a historian and a sociologist than I am a philosopher. So when I mobilize the actors' comments there about there being this elemental continuity, I really mean what 19th century chemists meant by elements. So this sort of fascination, especially with nitrogen, right? This kind of complete obsession. That's something that I don't quite understand, is how nitrogen got lifted up above all the other elements. And so tracing the fate of nitrogen through plants and then animals that eat them and the air and all of those things, that was really important. And so yes, of course, that has sympathies with this idea that the elements are given, right? There's nitrogen. It just happens to appear in different places in different forms. Yeah. But then the orientation that they take on that is, okay, well, we can take that as a ground state, I guess, but what is it? What is it that organizes it from one form to another? So coming up with the concept of Stoffwechsel was a way for Liebig to say, okay, there's nitrogen, there's an economy of nitrogen, but what is it that takes it from an unorganized state to an organized state, and those kinds of things. So that's very much what I mean there. And then you layer on the next layer, which is you say, okay, nitrogen might be a given, but you add something like the invention of the Haber-Bosch process for fixing nitrogen. That it's not that there's more or less nitrogen in the world than there ever would be at other times, but the forms that you find it in and its way of moving through the world is really, really different because of the human invention of that chemical process. So there is this kind of historicity to the configuration of nitrogen there. So there are different levels that you can operate in talking about matter there. And I don't think that it's necessary to go to the philosophical argument about givenness or not when doing a historical analysis of these figures working through this material.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Okay, so further questions? I see a hand, but you're going to have to come up to the microphone if you so please.
Sure. I have a question that I hope that the people might find entertaining. When I look at think about textbooks of biology dating back to, let's say, 50 years ago, and when I compare it to the textbooks of biology that are published today, the first many pages, probably many chapters of the textbook, look to me like chemistry books these days. Mm-hmm. In fact, probably most of it now looks like chemistry books. If you think about, the sort of the tension between the physics and chemistry, and if we look into the next 50 years, do you think that our biology books will look more like physics textbooks, describing quantum phenomena, or do you think we're going to be sort of stuck in this sort of situation where, well, yeah, when I drive a car in the engine, there are quantum events happening, but you really don't need to pull quantum mechanics into it to explain how the car moves. Where do you think the trajectory of history in biology is taking us?
Thank you for the question. Totally speculative, but I will say that I think for textbooks in particular, given the lag time that in the next 50 years, that chemistry and in particular this kind of if you look at something like chromatin biology, it is you cannot understand it without having a very very deep knowledge of physical chemistry and biochemistry and biological chemistry. It's interesting, there are different disciplines even within that subdomain. At UCLA, biochemistry is in the physical sciences, and I've forgotten what it's called. Biological chemistry is in the medical school. So that's a very interesting kind of division there. So given that lag time, I will say that the current renaissance in biochemistry and biological chemistry will be the thing that dominates. I'm not too sure about physics. There, I think it all depends on the operationalization of things like quantum physics
I guess it goes
as a
back
tool
to this development of tools and methods, right?
Right. Yes.
But it starts with a thought. There was a student who asked the question about, does it really matter?
Yeah.
But even our instruments that we develop reflect our thoughts and outlook on what's around us and about ourselves. I have another question, real quick. It's probably inspired by Albert Borgman, and I was struck by what you said about how we are trying to organize unorganized matter that fits certain needs. And so the situation where we find ourselves, where we manipulate genomes and manipulate nature, are we to blame Marx for that sort of outlook? Or Marx probably didn't come out of nowhere? In other words, if you were to look further deep into history of science and philosophy, where those thoughts and ideas about everything else around me is unorganized, and I need to organize it. And when you marry that to utilitarianism and maybe even Epicurean philosophy about, sort of maximizing the good for most people, where do things coming from?
Well, I would say that it goes far deeper than the 19th century, and I would probably hand it over to my colleagues who go deeper back, and this
It's sort of like a calming it, like you mentioned landmarks, historical or philosophical landmarks. Is that where sort of consolidated and sort of created this impetus for the rest of the
right. So
next century?
So I could point you to the famous book "What Is Life," where the depiction of organisms is that they constantly when you eat, you're imbibing negative entropy in order to not dissolve into disorganization. And I love this idea of sitting down at the restaurant and ordering some negative entropy, and that was a very, I think that's one easy landmark to say, where these concepts of life being an island, and the cyberneticians then take this up. So if you read Norbert Wiener, for example, he says life is an island in a dying world, and it's only the pattern of homeostasis that keeps and the information about how that pattern should be, that keeps that island present for this short period of time. So it does take very specific forms in the 20th century, which are closer to what we've inherited than these older forms, but they of course are uptakes and translations of older ideas.
Thank you.
So further questions? Okay, yeah. Come to the mic. I just saw your hand.
I could also take them afterwards.
Yeah.
I feel like maybe I went over time. And,
How are we doing on time?
We're 10 minutes behind.
We're 10 minutes behind. So that means we should stop. Okay, we should stop.
Yeah.
Oh yes, we should stop, and you should ask your questions later. So
Yes,
thank you, Chris.
I will be happy to answer your questions afterwards.